the clang of iron, the roar of fire, and the unrelenting pressure of survival. In medieval Europe, the blacksmith wasn't just a craftsman. He was a cornerstone of civilization, forging weapons for war, tools for life, and chains for justice. But behind the sparks and steel was a man beaten by heat, debt, and expectation. This is not the romanticized tale of noble labor. This is the raw, brutal truth of life as a medieval blacksmith in medieval Europe. The blacksmith stood at the heart of daily life. Every village, no matter how remote, relied on the forge, not as a symbol of romantic craftsmanship, but as a brutal necessity. Without the blacksmith, there were no plows to till the soil, no horseshoes for transport, no nails to hold buildings together, and no weapons when war arrived. His fire powered the survival of the entire community. The blacksmith's role stretched far beyond shaping metal. He produced the very tools that shaped the medieval world: scythes for harvesting, axes for woodcutting, hinges for doors, chains for punishment, and swords for battle. From the most basic farming implement to the most refined blade, his work affected every layer of society from peasant to king. Without his output, armies stalled, fields went untilled, buildings collapsed, and justice lacked its instruments of control. Yet, despite his vital importance, the blacksmith was often seen as something between laborer and outcast. The intense labor, constant exposure to fire and smoke, and the mysterious transformation of raw or into hardened steel gave rise to superstition. Some viewed blacksmiths with suspicion, associating their craft with arcane forces. In parts of Europe, particularly during the early medieval period, they were linked to folklore, pagan rituals, or even feared as wielders of unnatural power. Contrary to modern imagination, the blacksmith was not some noble artisan working in peaceful solitude. He operated in blistering heat, surrounded by heavy tools, molten metal, and relentless noise. His hands were often burned, scarred, or deformed from accidents. The tools he produced had to be precise, functional, and long-lasting. Failure could mean starvation in the fields or death in battle. The margin for error was non-existent. Each region had its own local ironwork traditions, but across Europe, the function remained the same: production under pressure. During wartime, blacksmiths were tasked with rapidly supplying arms, often swords, spearheads, arrow tips, and armor. In peacetime, they repaired carts, produced farm tools, and maintained the weapons of the local lord's garrison. Their work never slowed, and the expectations never eased. The rise of guilds in the 12th and 13th centuries did bring organization and, in some cases, protection, but it also brought control, regulations, and taxes. A blacksmith could not simply operate independently in cities especially. He had to follow guild rules, charge fixed prices, and sometimes face penalties for poor workmanship or undercutting rivals. In villages, where guilds held less sway, blacksmiths had more freedom but also more risk, often working alone without legal or social protection. The myth of the blacksmith as a romantic figure belies a much harsher truth. His life was laborious, dirty, and dangerous, yet he remained essential. He wasn't a background character in the medieval world. He was its infrastructure. Every tool, every weapon, every hinge on every door began in his hands. And those hands bore the marks of a life spent at the edge of fire and exhaustion. In medieval Europe, the path to becoming a blacksmith began early, often before a boy had entered his teenage years. Around the age of 10 or 11, children were handed over by their families to begin apprenticeship. It was not an offer. It was an expectation. For many, it was the only practical future available, especially for sons of laborers, widows, or freemen. Without land, in return for shelter, food, and instruction. The boy surrendered his freedom for up to 7 years. Apprenticeship under a master blacksmith was not just training, it was servitude. The apprentice lived under the same roof as the smith's family, usually in cramped quarters attached to the forge. He worked long hours without pay, beginning at dawn and finishing only when the fires cooled. His tasks started at the lowest rung-cleaning tools, fetching water, pumping bellows, and sweeping the soot-covered floor. Mistakes were punished swiftly. Obedience was enforced, not encouraged. Historical guild records, especially from 13th century London and 14th century Paris, confirm these terms. Contracts often detailed harsh conditions: no alcohol, no gambling, no leaving the house without permission. The Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths, established in London by the early 1300s, required strict discipline, and violations could lead to whipping, expulsion, or worse. An apprentice could be legally beaten by his master, as long as it did not result in permanent injury. Progress through the trade was gradual. After years of menial labor, apprentices would finally be allowed to observe the shaping of metal, learning to manage the fire's heat, the timing of hammer strikes, and the properties of different alloys. By the end of their term, if the master deemed them worthy, they could become journeyman workers permitted to earn wages and travel from forge to forge. But even then, becoming a master required money, influence, and approval from the local guild. Many never advanced past the journeyman stage. Inside the forge, the hierarchy was rigid. At the top stood the master, the owner of the tools, the instructor, and often the employer of multiple laborers. Below him, journeymen performed most of the skilled labor, while apprentices handled the repetitive or dangerous tasks. Some large operations employed helpers or even slaves, especially in regions like the Byzantine Empire or Moorish Spain, where enslaved labor was more common during certain periods. In places like 15th century Cologne, surviving guild documents outline fines imposed on masters for mistreating apprentices too severely or failing to teach them the trade. But enforcement was inconsistent. The forge was its own world, loud, dangerous, and almost entirely male. Injuries were expected. Blisters, burns, and respiratory damage from smoke inhalation were part of the job. There were no protections, no breaks, no negotiation. And yet, for the few who endured it, the trade offered a path out of poverty. Skilled blacksmiths could eventually secure steady work, social standing, or even open their own forges, though competition was fierce and guild rules often restrictive. Still, for a peasant's son in the 12th or 13th century, the forge offered a future with tools instead of hunger. But the price was paid in scars. Inside the medieval forge, survival depended on discipline, muscle, and endurance. A blacksmith's day began before sunrise. The fire never started cold. It had to be managed, stoked from embers left overnight, then coaxed into life with bellows' long wooden arms connected to oxide bags. These were pumped by apprentices in shifts, drawing air into the flames and raising temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius. There was no thermometer, only the color of the iron, dull red, bright orange, or white hot, and years of hard-earned instinct. Iron was the foundation. Extracted from bog or ore mined in crude shafts, it arrived in chunks, often carried from local sources or purchased through traders. Charcoal, not coal, was the fuel of choice, as it burned hotter and cleaner. Producing it required entire woodlands. Forests near villages were frequently cleared just to keep the smithy running. The environmental toll was understood but ignored. Fire was essential. Without it, there was nothing. Tools varied by region and purpose, but some were universal. The hammer, not one kind, but several: cross peens, straight peens, sledgehammers, and rounding hammers. Tongs for gripping, searing metal, chisels for cutting, punches for shaping holes, swages and fullers to mold patterns and curves. Every item was hand-forged, and many blacksmiths made their own tools. Anvil shapes varied, but the London pattern, anvil horned on one end, flat-faced on the other, became widespread in England by the 13th century. The forge was unforgiving. Sparks flew constantly. Scorch marks, burns, and embedded iron fragments in the skin were common. Blinding flashes from molten metal could damage eyesight. Blacksmiths who worked for decades often went partially blind in one or both eyes, a condition sometimes referred to in later guild records as forge blindness. The noise was relentless: hammer against anvil, iron against stone, fire crackling, bellows groaning. There was no silence, no rest. Mistakes were dangerous. A poorly tempered blade could shatter during use. A misaligned horseshoe might cripple. An animal, a hot piece of iron dropped or mistruck, could maim or kill. In towns, guilds enforced quality standards, not to preserve reputation, but because defective tools caused real harm. Complaints could lead to fines or revocation of one's license to practice. In rural areas, where oversight was limited, the consequences were more direct: a ruined harvest due to a broken plowshare, or a community blaming the smith for a failed weapon in battle. Heat stroke was another threat. For hours, blacksmiths worked inches from open flames, often with minimal ventilation. In summer, forges became ovens. Without modern knowledge of hydration or rest cycles, many collapsed during long sessions, especially under deadlines imposed by war or harvest season. Deaths inside forges weren't always documented, but ecclesiastical burial records list sudden fatalities at the anvil or by fire, often implying collapse or accident. There was no safety gear, no gloves, no eyewear, no aprons beyond thick leather. Injuries were not exceptions. They were expected. Some recovered, others didn't. The forge didn't pause for injury. It demanded output: plowheads, nails, door hinges, blades, and it did so relentlessly. This wasn't artisan work in the modern sense. It was survival through sweat, fire, and the constant risk of injury. A successful blacksmith wasn't just skilled. He was lucky to make it to old age with his eyesight, fingers, and hearing intact. Most didn't. A medieval blacksmith could forge a sword strong enough to break bone, but often couldn't break even. Despite being essential to the functioning of society, most blacksmiths hovered just above the poverty line. Their work was valued, but their status and income rarely matched their contribution. The tools they made fed armies, built homes, and tilled fields, but their own lives were often defined by financial stress, back-breaking labor, and the constant threat of debt. Owning a forge required more than skill. It required capital: anvils, bellows, tongs, hammers. Every piece of equipment came at a cost. Charcoal had to be bought or made, iron sourced from traders or local mines, apprentices housed and fed. In towns, Blacksmiths were required to join guilds, which imposed entrance fees, annual dues, and quality standards that couldn't be ignored. The Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths in London, established by the 13th century, recorded fines for non-compliance that could reach multiple shillings, a painful sum for a craftsman already struggling to stay solvent. Taxes were another weight. In England, by the 14th century, blacksmiths were often assessed under local taxation rolls like the lay subsidy, a form of poll tax or income-based assessment. Town records from Norwich and York list blacksmiths among those taxed at modest but significant levels. In rural areas, lords could impose direct demands, fixed production quotas, forced repairs, or even military equipment made under duress during wartime, all without fair payment. During the 100 Years' War, forges were often commandeered, and output demanded for the crown or local nobility. Payment, if it came at all, was delayed or delivered in promises, not coin. The pressure to produce was relentless. Unlike millers or bakers, blacksmiths rarely had regular, guaranteed customers. A poor harvest meant fewer tools needed repairing. A war might bring in weapon commissions, but also brought inflation, material shortages, and the risk of working under threat. During peacetime, demand fell sharply, leaving many smiths scrambling for work. Those who couldn't adapt or couldn't keep up with the costs of materials and taxes found themselves borrowing money, sometimes from local merchants, sometimes from the church, whose loans came with interest and moral judgment. In Paris, the Livre des Métiers of Etienne Boileau, compiled around 1268, offers detailed rules for tradesmen, including blacksmiths. It outlines fines for overcharging bans, on working at night without permission, and penalties for using substandard metal. These rules protected consumers, but squeezed craftsmen. In England, the Statute of Artificers in 1563 later tried to regulate wages and training, but by then, centuries of economic pressure had already hardened the trade. Few blacksmiths accumulated wealth. Some earned modest stability, especially in larger towns or under noble patronage. But for many, the work was cyclical, feast and famine, effort and exhaustion. They lived between hammer and hunger in a system that demanded output, but offered little cushion. Their fires kept society functioning, but their own lives often smoldered under debt, expectation, and fatigue. When war approached, the forge was the first to feel it. Before the banners were raised or the armies gathered, blacksmiths were summoned. Their role shifted from local craftsman to arms supplier, a pivot that brought urgency, pressure, and danger across medieval Europe. The survival of entire campaigns rested on the iron shaped at their anvils. During the 100 Years' War, English blacksmiths were mobilized to produce thousands of longbow arrowheads, billhooks, swords, and armor plates. In 1346, in preparation for the Battle of Crecy, accounts from royal requisitions show urgent requests sent to town smiths across southern England. In York, one document dated May 1346 required the immediate production of over 2,000 bodkin arrows, armor-piercing designs intended to penetrate French plate. Delivery was non-negotiable. Those who failed to meet quotas risked fines, loss of their forge, or even arrest. The demand for weapons varied by class and region. Wealthy knights commissioned bespoke arms, swords forged with high-carbon steel, hand-fitted mail links, and articulated gauntlets. These tasks took days, sometimes weeks, but militia, weapons, spears, axes, pikes, had to be produced in bulk. Often, blacksmiths worked overnight, shaping crude yet functional weapons in volume. In cities under threat, entire workshops turned into war factories. The First War of Scottish Independence saw similar pressures. In towns like Berwick and Carlisle, English authorities instructed local smiths to supply the garrisons with crossbow, bolts, reinforcing hinges, and metal reinforcements for wagons. During the siege of Berwick in 1296, chroniclers mention smiths being forced to labor under constant threat of incoming attack, repairing damaged armor and reshoeing horses for soldiers readying to counterattack. Payment was inconsistent. Some worked under contract from the crown or local lords, but most relied on promises, written guarantees of later compensation. In war-torn regions, those promises were often worthless. Others worked under coercion. In 14th century France, as the countryside destabilized during repeated English invasions, blacksmiths were sometimes conscripted by force, their forges commandeered, their apprentices taken for labor. Guild protections offered little help during war. Martial law often overrode local customs. In Florence during the 15th century, city blacksmiths were instructed by the signoria to divert all production toward weaponry during times of political unrest. Those who continued making civilian goods could be branded traitors. The same principle applied in German principalities under the Holy Roman Empire, where town smiths were monitored for loyalty and output during the Hussite Wars. The moral weight was not officially recorded, but it lingered in the background. Blacksmiths knew their blades would kill. Their arrowheads would fly into flesh. Their hammers, now shaping maces and flanged axes, prepared men for slaughter. But refusal to forge meant ruin or punishment. For many, there was no line between personal conviction and economic necessity. They were not soldiers, yet they contributed to the battlefield as directly as any footman. Survival required compromise. In times of war, the forge didn't just produce tools, it manufactured death. And the blacksmith stood in the middle of that machinery, forced to balance livelihood against conscience, with no shield from the consequences of either. In medieval Europe, the forge was not only a workshop, it was a space where belief, fear, and necessity collided. The blacksmith, standing close to fire, reshaping iron with hammer and flame, straddled the boundary between admired craftsman and suspected outsider. The church recognized the blacksmith's value, but never fully embraced him. Christianity, particularly in its early medieval expression, held a complex view of fire. It was a symbol of purification, judgment, and divine wrath, but also one of hell. The blacksmith's daily contact with it, and his ability to seemingly control it, gave him an ambiguous reputation. His mastery over metal, unseen by ordinary villagers, bordered on the mysterious. Few understood how raw or became a weapon or a plowshare. To the illiterate majority, it looked like transformation without explanation. That bred suspicion. In some regions, especially in the early Middle Ages, blacksmiths were associated with the supernatural. The Norse god Thor, protector and wielder of Mjolnir, was deeply linked to smithing in Scandinavian lore. Even after the Christianization of Scandinavia, echoes of those associations persisted. In Icelandic sagas and Germanic folktales, blacksmiths often appear as figures with knowledge beyond the physical, able to craft enchanted blades or forge with fire immune to ordinary laws. These ideas clashed with church doctrine. By the 11th and 12th centuries, local clergy began regulating blacksmith practices in some towns. Certain tools like branding irons or iron torture devices were restricted to use by authority under clerical oversight. Inquisition records from southern France in the 13th century occasionally reference smiths who were accused of sorcery or of producing forbidden implements. In 1233, a blacksmith in Carcassonne was investigated after townspeople claimed his horseshoes never wore out a sign, they said, of a pact with the devil. No formal charge was ever proven in rural areas. The line between Christian and pre-Christian belief remained thin. It was not uncommon for villagers to visit blacksmiths for more than tools to request charms, iron amulets, or protective nails said to ward off demons or the evil eye. Iron itself was believed to have purifying power. In parts of Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, blacksmiths were sometimes called upon to bless newborns or drive spirits from cattle. These practices, while not sanctioned by the church, were rarely confronted directly, especially if the smith was essential to the village economy. By the later Middle Ages, guilds helped normalize the blacksmith's image in urban settings. The presence of regulated training, Christian oaths, and economic oversight reassured authorities. But in the countryside, suspicion endured. The forge remained a place of both utility and unease, where crucifixes hung near the hearth, not just for decoration, but for protection. The blacksmith's fire-built weapons, tools, and livelihoods. But in the eyes of many, it also threatened spiritual danger. He was tolerated, sometimes respected, occasionally feared. A necessary figure, entirely trusted, in medieval society. Blacksmiths occupied a space that was both central and peripheral. Their craft was indispensably on tools. Weapons, nails, and fittings were fundamental to survival. Yet the men who produced them often stood apart from the communities they served. They were too essential to ignore, too skilled to dismiss, but too different to fully embrace. The social hierarchy of the medieval world was rigid. At the top, the nobility and clergy. Below them, wealthy merchants and guildmasters. Then came the artisans and laborers. The blacksmith sat somewhere in between. In towns, membership in a recognized guild brought a degree of legitimacy. In London, for example, the Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths, chartered in the early 14th century, allowed smiths to participate in civic life, voting, holding office, even serving on councils. But this inclusion came with limits. Their voices carried weight in matters of trade, but rarely in matters of policy or law. In rural areas, blacksmiths had no such shield. They lived on the edge of the village, often near water for cooling and far from homes to reduce fire risk. Their workshops produced constant smoke, hammering, and soot too noisy for neighbors, too dirty for the respectable. Their hands were stained, their clothes burned, their lungs filled with charcoal dust. The labor they performed was critical, but it was also seen as coarse. The paradox ran deeper. Peasants respected the blacksmith's skill, but did not consider him one of their own. Nobles and knights depended on his craft, but rarely invited him into their halls. He provided weapons for battle, yet was excluded from the glory of combat. He repaired plows that kept fields fertile, yet had no claim to the harvest. His usefulness defined him, but did not protect him from isolation. The nature of the forge contributed to his separation. It was a solitary environment, loud, dangerous, and poorly ventilated. Apprentices and journeymen offered company, but the work itself demanded focus and silence. There was no time for gossip or leisure. Many blacksmiths, even in towns, lived beside their forges in small, cramped quarters near the fire. Always on call, even in religious matters, their role remained. ambiguous. While some participated in church life, others were subtly excluded. In parts of Eastern Europe, blacksmiths were buried in separate plots close to the cemetery wall, but not among the community's dead. The reasons were rarely written down, but the implication was clear. The blacksmith's identity was forged in utility, not recognition. He was needed but not celebrated, familiar but not fully accepted. His role served everyone, yet few could say they truly knew the man behind the anvil. By the 12th century, blacksmiths in Europe were no longer just village tradesmen. In growing towns and cities, they were increasingly regulated, organized, and controlled through powerful trade guilds. These institutions claimed to protect craftsmen, but they also dictated who could work, what they could charge, and how far their influence could reach. Guilds functioned as both trade unions and regulatory bodies. In places like London, Paris, and Cologne, blacksmiths were required to register with their local guilds. The Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths in London, formally recognized in 1325, outlined strict rules for apprenticeships, tool standards, and pricing. Only guild members could legally operate a forge within city limits. Any smith working outside guild control risked fines, confiscation of tools, or even imprisonment. Access to membership was tightly controlled. To become a master, a journeyman had to complete years of apprenticeship, pay an entrance fee, and present a masterpiece, a complex forged item judged by senior members. Many capable craftsmen were denied advancement not for lack of skill, but because they lacked the funds, family connections, or political favor required for admission. In cities like Bruges and Florence, accusations of favoritism and corruption within smithing guilds appear in municipal records from the 14th and 15th centuries. Admission was rarely about merit alone. Guilds also regulated pricing. Blacksmiths could not simply charge what the market would bear. They were expected to adhere to fixed rates set by guild ordinances, which were updated periodically based on materials, labor, and economic conditions. In theory, this prevented exploitation. In practice, it often suppressed profit, especially when material costs surged during wartime or during shortages. Those who undercut prices to survive faced discipline, sometimes harsh. In Lübeck, a prominent trading city of the Hanseatic League, 15th century court records detail multiple cases where smiths were fined or banned for underpricing nails or tools. Guilds claimed to protect quality, and in many ways, they did. Poor workmanship was reported and penalized. Tools that failed in the field could damage reputations, and guilds took seriously their role in maintaining standards. But their power extended beyond craft. Guilds had political weight. In many towns, guild leaders sat on municipal councils, voted in local elections, and even influenced taxation. Their allegiance could shift civic policies, and their rivalries often fueled conflict. Power struggles between guilds were common. In Paris, the Blacksmiths' Guild clashed with armorers and farriers over jurisdiction. Who had the right to make certain items? Who could shoe horses for the royal stables? Disputes led to formal litigation, street violence, or intervention from city authorities. In Bologna, by the late 14th century, blacksmiths banded together to resist rising fees imposed by city officials in collaboration with merchant interests. A rare moment of collective defiance that saw temporary suspension of all forging activity. Guilds shaped the identity of blacksmiths across Europe. They offered protection against external threats, but also imposed internal hierarchies, economic ceilings, and social divisions. For a blacksmith, Joining a guild was not just a career step, it was submission to a system where control meant survival, but freedom came at a cost. Women were not absent from the forge, they were just written out of it. In the formal records of guilds, trade roles, and apprenticeships, blacksmithing appears almost exclusively male. But across medieval Europe, especially in smaller towns and rural communities, women worked the bellows, carried raw materials, repaired tools, and, in some cases, forged iron themselves. One of the few sanctioned paths for a woman into the trade was widowhood. When a blacksmith died, his widow was often permitted to take over the forge, not out of recognition of her skill, but out of practical necessity. The practice was widespread across England and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. City ordinances in London allowed widows to maintain their husbands' workshops if they did not take on new apprentices. In Lübeck, a 15th century record names Katharina Iswanzer, a smith's widow, permitted to operate her husband's forge for 3 years. After his death, she was allowed to work under her own name, but only on a provisional basis. In Paris, guild statutes occasionally made room for widows, referring to them as femmes solvables, women of good standing, who could manage the business side of a forge, but were expected to employ male journeymen for the physical labor. These rules presumed that women lacked the strength or training for smithing. But archaeological finds tell a more complex story. Excavations in York, Winchester, and Cologne have uncovered tools buried with female remains, indicating a level of participation not acknowledged in written sources. In rural France, 13 manorial rolls list female names next to iron tax obligations, suggesting they managed and possibly operated forges independently. Their labor was invisible in guild charters, but not in practice. While most blacksmithing women were exceptions, their erasure from historical record was not due to absence, but because the system wasn't built to record them. They worked behind the heat and noise, outside the charter, but inside the trade. By the end of the 18th century, the blacksmith's world had begun to contract. The Industrial Revolution redefined the boundaries of labor, production, and power. Machines, powered by coal and steam, replaced human strength. For centuries, the blacksmith had shaped society with hammer and fire. Now, entire factories could produce more in a day than a village forge in a month. The shift was gradual but irreversible. In England, blast furnaces and rolling mills expanded rapidly in the 1760s. Iron, once smelted by hand in charcoal pits, was now processed in large-scale foundries. The Belton and Watt steam engine, first installed in 1776 at the Soho manufactory in Birmingham, powered stamping hammers and cutting tools once operated by individual blacksmiths. These machines didn't tire, didn't pause, and didn't negotiate rates. They produced standardized goods, faster, cheaper, and in volumes unimaginable to traditional smiths. Urban centers like Manchester, Sheffield, and Glasgow absorbed much of this new production. Small forges closed or were absorbed into larger operations. In some cases, smiths adapted. They became machine operators, tool finishers, or specialized artisans. But many simply disappeared from the economic map. In rural areas, where industrial machinery arrived more slowly, blacksmiths held on longer, but even there, competition from mail-order, catalogs, and rail-delivered tools slowly undercut local production. Guilds dissolved or merged. In France, the blacksmiths' privileges were formally abolished during the Revolution. In England, The power of the worshipful company of blacksmiths waned, though it continued as a ceremonial body. What had once been a guarded, tightly controlled trade was now subject to market forces beyond any forge's control. Yet not everything vanished in certain towns and villages. Blacksmiths remained vital into the 20th century, not for mass production, but for repairs, horseshoeing, and custom fittings. In places untouched by railways or far from factory centers, the forge retained its place. Blacksmiths adapted their skill sets, some transitioning into farriery, others into mechanical work as internal combustion engines replaced carts. But the cultural role had changed. The blacksmith was no longer central to community survival. His value had shifted from essential to symbolic, a reminder of a slower, harsher world, where tools were made one at a time, and every blow of the hammer mattered. The legacy, however, didn't vanish with the trade. The blacksmith's mark exists in the riveted beams of medieval bridges, in the hinges of cathedral doors, in the swords unearthed from muddy fields. His skill built castles and plows, wheel rims and wagon axles. It shaped the battlefield and the farm, the monastery and the marketplace. Long before industry, before automation, and before mass production, the blacksmith was infrastructure. His work bore the weight of a world before steel mills and supply chains. What remains isn't just his iron. It's the architecture of survival he left behind.